Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Robin McKillop, and I'm the lead geomorphologist at Palmer. Over the past several years, it's become increasingly apparent that northern communities in Canada are in urgent need of baseline hazards information on which to make decisions about land development and infrastructure. Communities fortunate enough to have hazard maps are commonly challenged to interpret and apply them. What I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes is share with you some of our experience in community hazard mapping as a basis for identifying opportunities for improvement and better community buy-in. One of the things that's become clear with community hazard mapping projects so far is that they commonly fall short of providing the communities what they actually need. And I'd like to demonstrate this through three parts to this presentation. The first is to provide an overview and rationale for the need for hazard mapping. The second uses case studies to illustrate pros and cons of different approaches. And the third is to highlight opportunities for improvement and a move towards standardization. Climate change is rapidly occurring in the north at a rate that's outpacing what we see in southern Canada and elsewhere around the world. We're seeing unprecedented warming, changes in our precipitation patterns. We're seeing increased storminess, so areas that didn't experience lightning strikes are now undergoing some wildfires from this mechanism. With this change comes a variable landscape response, and as these trajectories of change continue, we can expect to see changes in landscapes and changes in the hazard processes that are affecting some of these communities. In northern Canada, we have the full range of diversity of hazards. We've got coastal flooding and erosion, and this relates to changes in sea level as well as changes in the extent of sea ice. We've got landslides and different mass movement processes that bring material from the hill slopes down to the valley bottoms. We've got riverine erosion and flooding that are driving risks towards infrastructure and land development areas. And lastly, we've got the one that hits most of the media these days, and that's permafrost degradation, or the thaw of ice-rich permafrost that can lead to impressive thermokarst and thaw slumps. One of the metaphors that I like to use to remind people about where we're at in the grand scheme of climate change and landscape response is the sleeping dragon, because we have to keep in mind that we're really on the cusp of accelerating instability in a lot of our landscapes. And so this really underscores the need for community hazard mapping to support community adaptation initiatives into the future. Layer on top of all of the natural changes that we're seeing in the environment, and we've got population growth. According to Statistics Canada, all three territories across the north are undergoing rapid population growth. We're starting to see tens of thousands more people in the years and decades ahead, and with this population growth comes development pressure. People need more land, people need more infrastructure, and people need reliable infrastructure. So hazard mapping really provides a spatial representation of the hazards posed by one or more hydrogeomorphological processes. And the classic example is a traffic light approach, right? Red is bad, green is good, and yellow is somewhere in between. Hazard maps provides information to support decision-making about land development and infrastructure in a changing climate. And it looks both into the future, about where we can plan for new land development infrastructure, as well as into the past in trying to evaluate maintenance expectations for existing infrastructure. It's difficult to get a handle on the exact number of communities that are already covered by hazard mapping products, but this was our sort of best guess based on what we could find online and what we're familiar with through our own work. Yukon is by far most advanced in covering its communities. It's probably about half or so of the communities that are now covered by some form of community hazard map. The other territories have significant room for improvement. And I think the key message that really underpins everything in what we've done through this presentation is that communities that are fortunate enough to have these hazard maps already are commonly challenged to properly interpret and apply them. And I think that's really important to keep in mind as we move forward. A variety of feedback has been received and is available through publications online about community hazard projects. I'd just like to share some of those and read some of the quotes for you, because I think it's really telling and really helps underscore a recurring theme. Many communities do not have planning staff to interpret the hazard mapping and bring forward the mapping data into local government decision making. The hazard maps are overly complex and need to be more accessible. The type and method of engagement needs to be known to undertake an effective hazard mapping project. That's a quote from Tara Tompkins at the GNWT, and she specializes in community adaptation. Adam Humphreys from Kluane First Nation in Yukon says, hazard mapping exercises must involve concise explanations to be understood by the audience. The content needs to be accessible, and simplicity is important. Adoption of hazards maps is a challenge, and often they sit on the shelf. And I can say as a consultant, that's one of the worst things we can hear about something that we invest so much time and effort in, right? If we produce a community hazard map, we want it to be readily accessible and used by the community now and into the future. So we need to start to change how we're producing these maps in order to address that criticism. It's also worth sharing one of the quotes from a publication looking at the evaluation of the effectiveness of these community hazard mapping projects in northern Canada. The effectiveness of the hazard maps in influencing land use planning was constrained by communication challenges between project creators and end users. These challenges included limited community access to the data and uncertainty surrounding how to operationalize the map suitability classifications. So how do the communities actually move forward with the information that has been communicated to them? I'd like to turn now to 4 case studies where I'm going to be able to use them as examples of some of the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches. This is a case study. It was a collaborative effort between the Canada Nunavut Geoscience Office as well as the Geological Survey of Canada. There was a major campaign back in 2013 where they did some field work in the coastal communities of Nunavut as well as some desktop analysis and interpretation. And this here is a map of Arviat, one of the communities, and it's referred to as a preliminary landscape map and landscape hazard map, and it provides information on the different relative scales of concern, let's say, related to landscape hazards. So some of the advantages of this product, it's very simple to understand, right? It's intuitive. It uses that traffic light approach, red, watch out, green, not so many challenges. And so that's good. And keeping in mind that this is a preliminary product, it is worth using this as an example to highlight a couple of the disadvantages or limitations. One is a bit of a lack of transparency in how these classes were derived, and hazard classes that are not that well defined, at least on the actual map product. What does low risk or low hazard mean compared to high? Some of the example explanations are in there, but they're buried in the accompanying publication, and so they're not readily accessible to the community members. I think standalone reports are really critical for these types of products. Fox Lake is a community, sort of a land use development area in southern Yukon, and we've been fortunate over the past several years to be involved with hazards and constraints mapping for a number of Yukon communities. This is just one example that we can use. And what I'd like to show you with this example is that for Fox Lake, we included constraints that are not just hazards. They also represent the challenges and cost implications of elements of the terrain. And so this is a good thing if you're making land use decisions. But at the same time, there's a bit of a mixture, right? We're not comparing apples and oranges. And so part of the feedback we received when we presented the results was that maybe the color scheme is a little bit misleading, because an area that's depicted as red may be red because of a cost implication like a higher water table or rugged bedrock topography, as opposed to a hazard like a landslide or thermokarst activity. So that's something that we can, I think, improve on, is trying to retain the individual metrics. One of the advantages, however, of this approach is you can see here on the right that we've got these different physical development constraints, and each of these values is still signified in the labels on the map. And so we've actually retained the individual hazard or constraint ranking, and I think that's helpful to make decisions about how to use these map products. The Northern Climate Exchange, based out of what is now Yukon University, has done a great job spearheading community hazard mapping in Yukon. They've done a lot of it in collaboration with Yukon Geological Survey, and they've got a very rigorous methodology that involves community engagement, provides a fairly comprehensive account of hazards, a nice succinct single end product, and there's transparency in how you get there. You can see here in the middle right of the screen, there's this box that provides the formula. Essentially, it's an index value that they use to calculate the hazard class that's applicable to that individual grid cell in their map product. You can see that there's slope steepness and aspect and materials and probability of permafrost that goes into that. Some of the challenges, though, with this approach is that there is a loss in information, right? There's this necessary loss when you start lumping things together because you end up with a hazard class that doesn't fully trace back to the cause of those hazards. There's also an explicit note about there being no representation of climate change, and so this is sort of a static map product, and it places the onus on communities and users to interpret and apply the results. If you look at these hazard classifications here, you'll realize that they're descriptive. They describe what one might encounter if they venture out into the field and find an area of a green color, or if they go to an orange color where it's categorized as moderately high risk. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell the communities what that means for their interests. What if they want to build a road? What if they want to upgrade some infrastructure? It doesn't help them translate this science-based hazard classification into practical knowledge for them to move forward. Last one I want to show is an example from some work by Laval University. They've done a fantastic job of advancing community hazard mapping throughout the Nunavik region of northern Quebec. And what they've done is taken all of these inputs, similar to the Northern Climate Exchange work, where they've got surficial geology and ground ice information, some of which is collected in the field, combine it with topography and different constraints, and they come up with this raster-based product that provides what they refer to as construction potential. What I really like about this approach is how they've taken the construction potential, or they've taken the hazard class essentially, and translated it into this construction potential that provides very relatable terminology, right? Terrain restricted for only certain types of foundations, adapted foundation techniques required. Wording like that is helpful. It's meaningful to the community members, and so I like what they've done with this product. Again, it's got great engagement, rigorous methodology, intuitive implications. I think if there are any cons to speak of with this approach, it's a little bit narrowly scoped. It's very focused on construction potential and doesn't really sort of think about broader applications of this type of map product. And there's some concern that it might be too busy. The quote here talking about maps needing to be more accessible and acknowledging that striking the balance is challenging, right? There might be too much information in a raster-based product like this. I'd like to focus attention now on opportunities for improvement and a move towards standardization. I think it's really clear from the feedback that we've gotten on our own projects and the feedback that we can read in the publications about community hazard maps that we need to take it to the next step, right? We're not quite there. We need to achieve that goal of providing communities with meaningful, practical information by translating the science of these hazard classes into plain language suitabilities, and also offering implications for different pre-specified community interests. So what do I mean by that? Well, make sure that you talk to the community early on. Find out what it is that they're trying to do, what challenges they face, how are they going to be using the information that you provide through these maps, and allow that to guide the actual approach and format of your mapping products. One of the things we hear time and time again is the importance for community engagement. This should be happening early on and should be happening as follow-ups to present the results of the product, and to the extent possible, incorporating information and local and traditional knowledge that they have. There's any number of quotes from the publications that speak to this, and one of the ones that I really liked was this idea that communities gain more of a sense of ownership by being engaged and having that opportunity to contribute, and that's important for buy-in. I'd like to use an example of a project we recently completed in draft format for the Northwest Territories Association of Communities and the GNWT, it was looking at establishing baseline surficial geology and hazards information for the community of Tuktoyaktuk to support climate adaptation initiatives. It's really essentially billed as a demonstration project, knowing how many communities there are within the territory that still lack mapping. With this approach that we referred to as climate-driven hazard susceptibility mapping, we were able to characterize coastal erosion, thermokarst, landsliding, and inundation and flooding hazards as a means of communicating to the residents and the managers how best to move forward with some follow-up investigations and where to focus attention. I can't get into the specifics of each of these classes now, but I want to highlight the key takeaways. On the left column here, you can see that we've retained individual hazard information, right? Coastal erosion, thermokarst, landsliding, inundation, and flooding. Each of those is still represented. We haven't lumped everything together and thereby losing information. We've used the intuitive traffic light approach for the hazard classes. We've got some generalized summary descriptions that I think is important to give people a sense of what they can expect within one of these hazard classes. And importantly, we've got some generalized implications for land development and infrastructure planning. I think these can be fine-tuned once there's more opportunity for community engagement, but at this point it's high level and it gives something to the communities that can really help them understand what it means for some of these different interests they may have. So there's a move towards standardization right now, and I think this lack of standardization is okay in some ways, but in other ways it creates inconsistency and confusion. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting is I've been part of a technical working group looking to establish a national standard for risk-based approach for community planning in northern regions. This is through the Standards Council of Canada and its Northern Infrastructure Standardization Initiative. And through this process, we're working towards the development of a framework for producing land development suitability mapping. This is sort of a work in progress, but I think it really addresses some of the concerns that have been expressed with respect to the operationalization of these hazard classes. What can the communities do with it? The focus of the standard development is on the methods, of course, providing that framework, on the classification and the legend itself, and emphasizing the importance of prior and follow-up engagement with communities. Essentially, it involves creating hazard products, translating them into suitabilities that are more familiar terminology, and offering some of these implications for the specific community interests. This is just an example of the type of legend that we're thinking of here. You can see the hazard class on the left, and then the land development suitability and associated implications across the top. The arrow represents that relative increase in the vulnerability of infrastructure or different land to some of these hazards. And you can specifically see community interest 1, 2, 3, 4. These are placeholders where the community can tell you what actually is of interest to them. Are they planning a boardwalk, in which case everything including high hazard areas might be conditionally suitable? Or are they planning a sewage lagoon or a community center where high hazard class terrain is generally unsuitable without significant mitigations? And there may be options to locate these features in moderate and certainly in lower hazard terrain. But it talks about some of the expectations and sort of the best practices that might be appropriate for each of these scenarios. The one thing that I should just underscore is that land development suitability mapping, of course, does not substitute ground-based investigations. Just a few key takeaways. Climate change and northern development drive a need for more community hazard mapping. I think that's clear. Communities that are fortunate to already have hazard maps are commonly challenged to interpret and apply their results. Community engagement really ensures that the local and traditional knowledge that they have and the specific interests they have shape the map results and formats, and that's really critical to getting buy-in. We're partway through the development of a national standard to improve the consistency, transparency, and utility of community hazard mapping products. And lastly, hazard maps that culminate in ranked classes without some sort of translation into implications stop short of what communities actually need. Thank you very much. You're welcome to send me an email if you have any questions or would like to discuss further. Take care.